All right. Boker Tov. Good morning, everyone. Some of you have already seen it, Boker Tov, this morning. So Boker Tov, I hope it's still Tov. I am so honored and excited to introduce Dr. Judith Kates, who's going to be teaching us this morning and giving us deep insights into my favorite piyut from the high holidays, Ki Anu Amecha. Judith Kates just recently retired from Hebrew College in Newton. She received a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University, where she taught literature for 11 years. She's one of the core faculty members, so she just retired from being one of the core faculty members and one of my teachers and Rabbi Suzanne's teacher as well. And she teaches in programs of adult learning across the Jewish community, including ours. We're so grateful. And she's the co-editor with Gail Twersky-Reamer, another TBZ member, of Reading Ruth, Contemporary Women Reclaim a Sacred Story, and beginning anew, a women's companion to the high holidays. And in 1998, Dr. Kates received the Keter Torah Award for Outstanding Educators from the Bureau, from BJEP, the Bureau of Jewish Education of Greater Boston. So I am thrilled to turn it over to Judith.
So Boker Tov, everyone. Really happy to see you all. I can't compete with Rabbi Jonas Steinberg, who taught last week from a Venetian palazzo. But this is coming to you from the wonderful salt marsh right outside, next to this wonderful salt marsh in Wellfleet on Cape Cod, which is one of God's wonders, if not one of the human wonders that Venice is. We're going to begin with just orienting ourselves in the High Holiday Machzor to the poem that we're going to be talking about. And Rav Tiferet is just going to play us a version of, it's not us, but people like us singing this. And I think you'll find it very familiar.
ואתה גורלנו, אנו שונאיך ואתה רוענו, אנו חרמך ואתה נותרנו. אנו פעולתך ואתה יוצרנו, אנו רעייתך ואתה דודנו, אנו סגולתך ואתה קרובנו, אנו עמך ואתה מלכנו, אנו מאמירך ואתה מאמירנו.
I think we'll stop here. Thank you so much, Rav Tiferet. So if you could put up on the screen the words. Great, thank you so much. This piyut, this poem, is one that is really familiar to us. On Yom Kippur, we actually sing it in every single one of the 5 services, in Kol Nidre, in Shacharit, in Musaf, in Mincha, in Ne'ilah, as part of the section called Slichot, prayers of forgiveness. And it's where I want to talk about a little bit later on exactly where it is in the Slichot service, and what that might mean for us, actually, because it is actually what we sing just before we begin the vidui, the connection, where we start to say chatanu, and you know, as they say, chap slichas, you know, if not beating our breasts, gently tapping our bodies, asking for forgiveness. But this is a song that we seem, I think all of us sing with tremendous, both physical and spiritual energy. We do it more and more powerfully as our physical powers wane, I think. That is starting from the beginning of the fast, and as we come toward the end of the fast, especially in Ne'ilah, we are singing this at a full voice with our full spiritual power. And there's a sense that we throw ourselves into it, but also we sing it faster and faster, I think. And what I'm hoping that we can do this morning actually is to stop and slow down, and think about the words, not only this wonderful rhythm that we generate within ourselves, which, and I'm not in any way trying to take away from the power of that rhythmic singing that we do. But I think it's also crucial to be aware of, as aware as we can, of the meaning of what we're saying, and how it's been put together. So I want to back up just a bit and say something about the genre, the category of prayer that this belongs to. Rav Tiferet referred to it as a piyut, and this is a special term in Hebrew, Pei Yud Vav Tet, which may or may not be connected to the word poet, which has a Greek root, but it is the term that's used for specifically liturgical poetry. And we have a tradition of actual composed poems that goes back at least to the 6th century CE. And the people who composed such liturgical poems are called, each one is a paitan. They're paitanim, from the same root, so it's something like to poeticize, but they're also liturgical poems that there's a whole literature of them. One of the most famous is actually from the 6th century CE, named Eliezer Kalir. And these were actually chazanim. It was the tradition for centuries that a chazan was somebody who would compose poetry for Shabbat based on the parsha sometimes, and certainly for holidays based on various both biblical texts and themes that were related to holidays. And a valued chazan would be somebody who would be composing these poems and performing them. I think an analogy would be the way that Bach wrote cantatas for all the different Sundays in that were and the special holidays that were celebrated in the Lutheran Church. And this, as I say, this is a tradition that went on for centuries, and they often are highly complex in their structure, their poetic structure, using rhyme and alliteration, and playing with different formations based on the Hebrew roots, and often with quite a complex language, and not always as open and easily understood as the one that we're talking about today. And the way that most of us are familiar with these piyutim is because unlike the regular Shabbat Siddur, the Machzor, the High Holiday Prayer Book, preserved many of these piyutim that had been composed, both especially in the Slichot section, the prayers for forgiveness, but also in all the prayer sections. Rabbi Jonah last week was talking about the theme of Melech and making God, what it meant to make God our sovereign on Rosh Hashanah. And I'm sure that many people are familiar with the many piyutim that we sing about God's sovereignty, God's greatness, God's power on Rosh Hashanah, playing and ringing all the changes on the word Melech, God as king. The Machzor, in all the different sections, but especially in Slichot, the forgiveness prayers, preserves these wonderful piyutim. Many of you I know are familiar with Ki Hinei Kachomer, we are like the clay in the hands of the potter. It's a beautiful piyut using all kinds of imagery, but the language is somewhat difficult. It uses nouns and verbs that we're not all that familiar with, unlike the one that we sing in every single service as the climax of our Slichot prayers, the one that we're talking about today. So the poet who composed this particular poem was a paitan from the Middle Ages. Many of them are medieval. They're not something like Lecha Dodi, which is also a piyut, is very late because it's the 16th century. And in terms of Jewish traditional compositions, that's late. But many of these piyutim that we have in the Machzor are from earlier centuries. And this particular poet just chose as his model for his composition some of the verses actually that we find in Shir HaShirim, and the way in which the Midrash reflected on Shir HaShirim, the verses from Shir HaShirim. So if Rav Tiferet, if you would for a minute just scroll down to this, here's the Midrashic text, Midrash Shir HaShirim Rabbah, that seems to be the basis for the actual structure of the poem. And I want to come back to the content of it later and the fact that it's from Shir HaShirim a little bit later, but just to show you that it seems that this paitan had in mind a verse like the one that you see in the paragraph marked Aleph, Dodi li va'ani lo. Dodi li va'ani lo. So this is in the first person singular, whereas our poem is in the first person plural. But nevertheless, what we have is exactly the same kind of pattern that we see throughout our piyut. A phrase, dodi li, and then a parallel, va'ani lo. And it takes off from that in the Midrash and says, and wants to interpret dodi li as God is for me, hu li lelohim. Dodi li, he is my beloved, becomes he is my God. And va'ani lo, and I am his, becomes va'ani lo li'uma, and I am his as a people. I am his people. Now, I'm going to have to say at the outset, we're going to have to just live with the way in which the masculine gender is at work here throughout. This is the biblical language, it's the rabbinic language, it's the medieval language, and we can inwardly or to ourselves shift genders or degender it if we wish, but this is the way the traditional language works. So in one of the wonderful things about Shir HaShirim, of course, is that it's one of the few places in the Hebrew Bible where you have shifting 50-50 between male and female language. But when the rabbis interpreted Shir HaShirim, for them it was clear that the ani is the female beloved, the female lover or the female beloved, and that the male voice in Shir HaShirim represents God as the male lover beloved. So he is, when it's dodi li, that's hu li lelohim, he is my beloved, and va'ani lo, I am his, is the female Israel, of the community of Israel, saying, I am his people. That is taking the collective and making it into a single person. That's what happens in the Midrash. So, Rav Tiferet, if we can then scroll back up to our piyut. Thank you. What we can see right away is that what our Paitan has done is to take that structure and multiply it and embroider it and create out of his, I am assuming this is a male poet, out of his imagination, image after image that based on the same kind of structure with these two short phrases in parallel to each other, expressing connection between anu, we, and ata, you. Anu amecha ve'ata Eloheinu, which seems to be taken straight from the Midrash that we just looked at. But these verses also, of course, are rooted in biblical phrases. And although I'm not going to take the time to try to pedantically go through every single one of these images and locate verses in the Tanakh on which the poet presumably based his sense that these were significant images to use, trust me that they are actually all of them based on biblical sources, whether in Torah, in prophets, and also, of course, often in Psalms. Anu vanecha va'ata avinu, also very familiar idea. We are your children, you are our parent. As I chose the Lev Shalem Machzor for the translation here, because it is sensitive to how off-putting the insistent masculine language sometimes can be. But it's, we are either your sons or your children, but certainly it's Avinu. And of course we know that Avinu Malkeinu, I mean, this is our high holiday theme over and over again. These are images that are very familiar. Anu avadecha va'ata adonenu, we are your servants and you are our master. Adon, Lord, or master. We're quite used to them, but many of the images that follow are somewhat striking for us. We're not used to hearing them, but they do have biblical sources. So what I'm hoping that we can do, and I hope we can do this in conversation together, is to go slowly through these images and try to think about what they offer us as prayers, people who are praying, particularly in a mode of thinking about our need for forgiveness, our sense of ourselves as people who are in some ways limited or even lacking, thinking of ourselves as we do in Slichot, as people who have at the least fallen down on the job and not managed to accomplish everything that we hoped for, whether it's in actual deeds or in terms of our own internal work on ourselves, our character, the way we are in relation to the people in our lives, or in relation to God, and also to be trying to think about what may be enriched for us by the various images that are coming up. So I grouped those images together because I have a point that I have thought about, but I really am hoping that we can, in conversation together, think about what these images bring up for us. So, as I said, I think the first three are familiar for us. And we are your people, and you are our God. We are your children, and you are our parent. We are your servants, and you are our master or our Lord. So I'd love to hear what anyone would want to suggest about what you think or what you feel when you are saying this or hearing this, any of these images. So if we can, if you can, I think there's a, Rav Tiferet, there's a, under the reactions, people can raise hands. Can we do that?
Yeah, people can raise their hands using the reaction button,
or just raise your hands on the screen.
Yeah. Susan,
thank you.
So I think two things come up for me. One is, well, let me say a few things. One is that we're not alone, that we belong to each other. There's a mutual relationship going on here. Then I think about, and then is there some responsibility or is there some obligation that is involved then in that mutuality and relationship. And then I also hear that sense of belonging. Again, we're not alone. We belong to each other. And what does that mean if we belong to each other? What do we owe each other? What do we expect? So those are some things that come up for me.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Fran.
Fran,
Muted, Fran.
A lot of what Susan said was what first came to me, but in addition, I feel that what is being laid out right away is our sense of vulnerability and why we need God, because there is a power imbalance. We are the child. It feels to me like a reminder. Don't forget to take care of us. I'm the kid, you're the parent. I'm the one who is you're the power. I love you, we love each other, but you're on top, and I recognize that. I'm the vulnerable one, and I need you. That's what I'm hearing in those couplets.
So thank you both for these very helpful and insightful comments. And does anyone else have a thought to add here?
Suzanne?
Thanks. So this reflects also what you mentioned, Judith, the Avinu Malkeinu. The first three here are a little softer because we can understand, at least in this translation, God, parent, and master versus the language of just father and king. So for the people who are reading in translation, it's much more accessible than this language of constant father, king, father, king, father, king.
So I really appreciate these comments, all of them. That is that what we're, one of the things that our poet has done, first of all, as Susan was saying, is to constitute us as individuals, as part of a community, as a part of a collective. And it might be that what the poet wants us to start feeling in as powerful a way as possible is that we need each other in order to seek forgiveness. That it's incredibly difficult to be alone. And as you were saying, vulnerable, or Fran, as you were saying, vulnerable, asking for forgiveness of, and is particularly as asking for forgiveness, and I'm thinking also of what Suzanne brought in, of asking forgiveness from some this awesome, awe-inspiring, but formidable and perhaps fearsome power that is so beyond us. If we are only thinking about that language of Lord, or even at least in the conventional sense of Father as the judging one, the disciplinarian. Yes, that what the poet establishes for us is a sense of belonging, as Susan put it, that we are in this together, and that gives us a certain power to be in this relationship. But at the same time, as Fran was pointing out, there's no question that we're talking about hierarchy here. There's a real differentiation, and to some extent that continues in the next set of images, which are, as I was saying, not quite as familiar for us. Anu kehalecha, we are your congregation. We're familiar with kehillah, right, or kahal, as the congregation. And but you, v'ata chelkenu, you are our portion. Rav Tiferet, were you saying something?
No, I was looking at this. These next three are really interesting to me. You know, anu kehilacha, like where are you? You have, like we're your everything. Like you have all of us, but we only have a chelek of you. Mm-hmm. And so it's just so it's really fascinating the relationship that's set up in this one. And I was really struck by the next one. And I'm not even sure how to think about this. Anu nachlatecha, like we're your inheritance. Like God has been dealing with a version of us, you know, like through the generations, and we are just moving toward, our experience is moving towards God through our children and our grandchildren, and it's this interesting temporal relationship.
That is a fascinating way of thinking about this. I totally agree with you that those two images are really need unpacking, and the way that you unpack them really resonates very powerfully with me, and I'm sure with others. I wanted to point out, though, that in fact in the Bible, this idea of both chelek, portion, and nachala, inheritance or heritage, are always associated with what God is giving us. God is giving us a nachala. God is giving us a chelek in God's world. A portion, an inheritance, especially that nachala language is used over and over again about the land in the Torah, about the land that is our goal, is the promise, but it's also what we at least to some extent achieve. But it's all about us. And to say that, and chelek v'nachala is also a phrase that often goes together. So look what's happened in the poem. It's, we are your kahal, we are your kehila, and you are our chelek. And then that is that God is the chelek, and then we become the nachala, God's nachala, and ata, you become the goal that we're striving for, presumably. So the poet is doing this wonderful play with the ways in which these words and ideas are usually showing up in the Bible, but really pushing us to think about ourselves. So Rav Tiferet has given us one way of understanding what happens here. And I'm wondering whether anyone has any other thoughts about what does it mean to say that we are God's kehila, and that God is our chelek, our portion, and that we are God's heritage. We are God's, Rav Tiferet was emphasizing the temporal aspect of this, perhaps the idea that God inherited something about us from the past, which needs to go forward. But it also, there's also a way of thinking about this as God has some sort of stake in us. Just as, so Suzanne?
I think it's more of a question, Judith. So I'm just trying to look at all of these as differing relationships. So in the first three, we have a sense of being cared for in our vulnerability. But this part that Rav Tiferet just talked about, the temporal and the play, Judith, that you just mentioned, and then we're going to move into different kinds of relationships, a shepherd or a guardian of a vineyard, a creator and a spouse. So we're moving from, into more loving, intimate relationships, cherished. And so I'm wondering how you see these two relationships as the bridge from the first part to the more intimate relationship. Does that make sense? Am I being articulate?
You're being extremely articulate, and I think it's a very helpful way to think about what's happening here. I think I find it really interesting to think about the relationship between the flock and the shepherd as intimate, or between
moving towards the more, it's fluid,
right.
It's moving towards the more intimate of spouse, cherished one. Yeah.
Right. And also the idea of a vineyard, and the one who is the guardian of the vineyard, or the caretaker. The caretaker would be another way of translating notrenu. And then, of course, the idea that we are God's pi'ulah. So we are God's, they translate it here as your creatures. We are God's creatures, that is, those which God has created, but pi'ulah is also work. We are the work that God has done, and God is then God as the potter, the same image that we have in the famous Ki Hine Kachomer, B'yad HaYotzer, that piyut that we sing on Kol Nidre night. That is the clay in the hands of the potter. But it's not, we're not being called a clay, but we're being called a finished work, a pi'ulah. I'm really, as a movement toward more intimacy, it's a really interesting way of thinking about this. But I'm feeling it also still as these are all kinds of images that would enable us to allow ourselves to feel completely taken care of. At least that's how I hear it. The flock with the shepherd, the vineyard with the one who is its guardian, its caretaker, and then the idea that somehow all of us becomes a work that God has been working on, the way a potter shapes a vessel. It's rather, I hear it as a powerful image. Now I see a hand up from Judith Clow.
I think these three also have the implication that there are outside forces that the concentration at first is on our congregation, on our tehillah, and then there are other forces that we need care from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's very powerful also. I mean, think about the role of the shepherd in protecting the sheep. And I think, Deborah, did I see your hand?
Rachel had her hand up first.
Oh, Rachel, thank you.
So I'm going to be a bit of a troublemaker.
Good.
I want to go back to the fourth verse.
Mm-hmm.
Anu kihilatecha v'ata chelkenu. And it just, we are your congregation and you are our portion. It's hard for me not to read that as we're your whole and you are just a part. And that just feels funny to me.
So when you're thinking about portion in the sense of it's a section,
right,
rather than the whole thing.
Exactly.
Right. So yeah, I think that certainly for us as English speakers, that's the first meaning that we would have for portion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although I do think I don't want to, that would be a really a radical way of going at things. No, seriously, and you could, I can imagine creating a wonderfully radical theology from this, in that God is not whole without us. And there's an absolutely wonderful radical midrash. It's actually in the midrash on Lamentations, where God says, you are my witnesses, and if you are not my witnesses, then I am not God. This is in the midrash. So I'm hearing that theology from what you're suggesting, Rachel. But I also want to fall back a little bit on my Bible scholar self and say that, in fact, chelek and nachala are, in essence, synonyms. They're used, that is, what God is offering us is chelek v'nachala, meaning a heritage or an inheritance within God's world. God's world is larger than the chelek, or larger than the nachala, but the chelek is as large as the nachala. But it's really crucial to hold both of these ideas at once in our minds, I think. So I'm looking at time. I want to, but I also want to hear. I think Deborah had a hand up. Is that right?
I did, but why don't you move on?
No, please. I really want to hear what you have to say.
Oh, thank you. I just, I'm trying very hard to keep myself in the mood of a supplicant as I'm hearing this. And I can't shake the opening ideas of the power struggle within each of these phrases. That it is both, as Rachel acknowledged and Judith acknowledged, there's always a threat and there's always a little bit of a loving portion. It just keeps going back and forth. And yet I can't shake the idea that we're somehow a bit of a caste in the very powerful form of being identified as lesser than, and that there's some kind of paternalism in here, in the language. And I just want more ways into the mutuality of this relationship.
Thank you so much for that comment, because that is exactly what's about to happen. And that's one of the things that's most extraordinary to me about this poem. We have all the reason I put my little brackets where I put them was because I see exactly all of those verses that we've looked at so far, as you're describing them, as they're all hierarchy of one kind or another. But when we come to Anu Rayatecha, Ve'ata Dodenu, which is straight out of Shir HaShirim, straight from the Song of Songs, which is that, as I said, that love poem where the relationship is completely mutual and equal. This is the language of a mutual love affair. Anu Rayatecha Ve'ata Dodenu. We are your spouse and you are our beloved. It could be you could translate it exactly the other way. We are your beloved and you are our spouse. That is, those words are used interchangeably in Shir HaShirim for the lovers. They use that language, or the verse that we saw being quoted in the Midrash, Ani lidodi v'dodi li. Dod and Raya, they are totally equal, totally mutual And it's also, of course, pure love language. It's only love language. And similarly with Anu Segulatecha Va'ata Krovenu, of course, the language of Segula, your cherished ones, is how they translate it. It's straight from that famous verse in chapter 19 of Exodus, just before God reveals God's self to the entire people on the mountain and says, I am taking you as my people, and you will be for me Am Segula, a precious, a treasured, a cherished people. The Ata, and you, God, are Kurovenu. Well, yes, it means you are near to us, as our translation has it, but a Karov is a member of our family. Krovim are family members, right? When it says, yes, it means near to us, but it means that we are family together. That's where we have arrived in the poem. And then it moves back. It moves back to Anu Amecha Ve'ata Malkenu. We can't forget and we can't let go of. And in fact, it's crucial that we maintain also that powerful sense of God as more powerful than us, as the sovereign, as the one who represents everything that is more than and beyond us, but that we are nevertheless in relation, in significant relation to, by being Amcha, your people. And then we come to the climax of the poem, which is Anu Ma'amirecha Va'ata Ma'amirenu. Exactly the same words used for both parties in this, both persons in this relationship. We and you. We, and they, was extremely happy to see how they translated that here, because it really is a helpful translation. If Rav Tvered, if you could scroll down to the next page just briefly. On the left-hand side, you see from Deuteronomy, the poet has picked a verse from Deuteronomy, these are the final words from Moses' great long speech to the people of Israel. And this is at the very end of Deuteronomy, where this statement is that we are in covenant with God. We're talking about being in covenant with God. And covenant, of course, is a relationship of mutuality, where we each have obligations to each other. In the Hebrew, et Adonai He'emirta hayom liot lecha lelohim. You have, as the translation has it, you have affirmed this day that the Lord is your God, and we promise to walk in God's ways, and that you will obey God, and the Lord or God, He'emir, has affirmed you this day as God has promised you. So exactly the same language is being used, both by of what God is doing and what we are doing. But now can we go back? Sorry, Rav Tifa, go back to right. What happens here is that we, as they translated here, they're emphasizing that this word, laha'amir, which JPS translated as to affirm, comes from the same root that means to speak or to say. And so they translate anu ma'amirecha as we are the ones you address, ve'ata ma'amirenu and you are the one to whom we speak. I want to translate it differently. Anu ma'amirecha, we are the ones that you enable to speak. The conjugation is the he feeler, the causative. So we are the ones that you cause to speak. The ata ma'amirenu, and you are our source of speech. You are our source of speech. And you are what we speak or how we speak. So it's not only a language of love here, but it's a language of empowerment. That is, the word ma'amir as a noun can also mean instructor or teacher. So if you, and this is a little bit of a midrashic speculation on my part, that the poet is suggesting to us that we are given by God the capacity to teach, and that God takes us as what enables God to teach. Anu ma'amirecha, we are what enables you to teach, and you are what enables us to teach or to speak. We are so it's not only about speaking to, but it's having that the power of speech and the power to be filled with what is necessary to speak, to say. And of course, we can't help but having the association with the way in which God created the world, which is through Amar, Amira, Vayomer Elohim, Yehi Or. It's all that same root that's used about God's creation of the world. So there, I hear in that final pairing, and not only love, but empowerment. Mm. So I also included, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes just thinking about where exactly this particular piyut is placed. It's placed just before the vidui, the confession. And we using the same pattern of anu, this, and ata, that, we, this, but we go on to say, anu azeh fanim, we are insolent, v'ata rachum v'chanun, you are gracious and compassionate, right? Anu kishe oref, we are obstinate, v'ata erech apayim, you are patient. Anu malei avon, v'ata malei rachamim, we are filled with transgression. V'ata, and you are filled with rachamim, with compassion, with mercy, right? We are about to launch ourselves into a real expression of how full of failure we feel, how much in need of forgiveness we feel, how vulnerable. But I'm wanting to suggest that we come to this position of speaking in this way, of feeling in this way, only once we have made this whole poetic journey with all the power that its rhythmic repetitions, its powerful statement of over and over again of relationship, of parallelism, mutual connection. Only at that point are we then being drawn into, and perhaps it's only at the end of this journey that we even can allow ourselves to be in a position to literally submit ourselves. And I use this word carefully and advisedly, because I know it's not a word that is easy for most of us. But to submit ourselves to this feeling that we have failed, that we are desperately in need of help to put ourselves back together and to do better. The poem, with its incredibly rich statement of mutual relationship, enables us, both because of the belonging that we spoke about in the beginning, the sense that we are together in this, and because the relationship itself is a relationship that is not only a one of hierarchy, but one of mutual love, of mutual belonging, that we are the nachala, that God and we belong to each other, and also mutual empowerment, that by our speaking, we are empowering God and God is empowering us. It's only in that context that we then start to do that confession, that statement of where we've gone wrong, how much in need of help we are. I know that we've run out of time, but I really hope that when the next time we throw ourselves into our singing, that this will be a way of making it even more powerful for ourselves on Yom Kippur. So I think we're going to go out hearing the poem again as sung. If we could. Great. Thank you so much, Rob.
כי אנו עמך ואתה אלוהינו, אנו בניך ואתה אבינו, אנו עבדיך ואתה אדוננו, אנו קהלך ואתה חלקנו, אנו נחלתך ואתה גורלנו, אנו שונאיך ואתה רוענו, אנו חרמך ואתה נוטרנו. אנו פעולתך ואתה יוצרנו, אנו רעייתך ואתה דודנו, אנו סגולתך ואתה קרובנו, אנו עמך ואתה מלכנו, אנו מאמירך ואתה מאמירנו.
Thank you so much, Rav Tiferet, and thank you all for your wonderful insights. I really appreciate the opportunity to reflect on this. Like Rav Tiferet, I've always just loved this piyut, and it's a wonderful opportunity to think together about what's so special about it.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you for this fantastic teaching and deepening our process of teshuvah and coming back for Elul. And we will make sure that the recording and the source sheet and a link to this B'nai Jeshurun Kianu Amecha go out in happenings this week.
So,
thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Yes. Be well, everyone.